Mm. Good morning, everyone. We are so happy you could join us this morning to hear from the Superintendent of Grand Haven Area Public Schools and the Superintendent of Spring Lake Public Schools. And also joining us in a bit will be Chris Glass, who serves as Director of the Legislative Affairs for West Michigan Talent Triangle. The West Michigan Talent Triangle. Excuse the dogs. I apologize. Chris represents the West Michigan Talent Triangle, which is an advocacy consortium that consists of Kent, Muskegon, and Ottawa area ISDs in their 41 constituent districts. In his role as advocates for public education at a local, state, and federal level. Prior to joining WMTT, he worked for over a decade in various legislative affairs positions in the nonprofit and business sectors. He will be joining us in a bit. Good morning again. I'm Joy Gash. I'm president of the chamber, and so pleased that we have our two superintendents that can spend some time with us during this very, very, very busy time for both of you. We're looking forward to your updates. Andy, I believe you're going to kick it off this morning, and you and Dennis are going to kind of share the slides and the process, and then you'll turn it over to Chris, who will be joining us later. So welcome, Andy. Welcome, Dennis. I'm so glad that you could join us this morning. We want to make sure that we give you enough time to get everything in, so take it away.
All right, thanks, Joy. Good to see everybody. Thanks for having us. And yeah, schools haven't been without impact, of course, either throughout the pandemic. So we're happy to have the opportunity to share. I'm really proud to serve in a community where school districts like Spring Lake and Grand Haven have great partnerships and think very similarly, and can work really successful together. I couldn't be happier to have a colleague like Dennis Furton on the other side of a bridge, that I know I can count on when I've got a question or need help. And Chris Glass is just the same. He's such a strong advocate for education, and really brings a lot of information and helps us dive in to understand more deeply what's happening at the state level, which informs us very well and gives us good information. So with that, I'm going to just see if I can share my screen here, and we'll kick off the presentation. So opening slide, who's this? Present. So I think I've talked through the first slide. The last thing I'll say is you'll notice it's orange. That's because we didn't want to bias with Grand Haven Buccaneer blue and gold or Laker red and gray. So I combined Buccaneer gold and Laker red for a beautiful sunset color for Grand Haven of orange. So with that, Dennis Furton is going to talk a little bit about the overview.
All right, thank you very much. And thanks to everybody who's participating as an attendee in today's webinar. Thanks to the Chamber for the opportunity to present and share. This has been unprecedented times for public schools. What we're facing today, what we faced for the last 2 months, and what we're probably going to be facing in the fall, well, not probably, definitely going to be facing in the fall, has really tested our capacity to change and to grow. So our presentation today, I think Andy would agree, we could probably talk for 2 hours about everything that we've done and that we will be doing. But we don't have 2 hours to do that. So we boiled it down to a discussion about remote learning as it stands today in the 2 districts. We're going to touch on social emotional wellness because really that's never been further to the forefront of our thinking and our planning than it is today with our students. We have a real tangible story to tell about what we're doing to provide food to our communities. We want to touch on planning for next fall. You're not going to find out the secret of the universe, which is what school will look like in the fall from us, but we will tell you what we're doing today. And then, unfortunately, this is not just a pandemic that's impacting the health of our community, but it's also affecting the finances of businesses and homeowners and individuals within the community. And it's going to impact our budgets both this year and next. So we want to touch on those aspects. So that's a lot of information. We're really going to try to be brief with the hopes that between the 2 of us and Chris, and then maybe some questions, if we get a chance for that, we can give you the information you want to know from this webinar.
So with that, we'll just dive into some of what's happened around remote learning. So to just step back to the middle of March when schools were closed, we learned on Thursday night that we'd have 1 day of school on Friday, and then we were closed going forward, at least through our spring break. And of course, that's turned into the remainder of the school year. That first 3 weeks was really kind of a no man's land for public schools. There was no guidance or specific requirement on what schools were supposed to be doing in that time. I think Dennis and I are both really proud that our districts stepped right up and continued learning from that first Monday going forward. And I think for both of us, it turned into a really good opportunity to dabble, experiment, gather information on what students had connectivity, what students didn't have connectivity, so that when we got near our spring break and there was another executive order from the governor about the requirements for remote learning for the rest of the year to remain eligible to receive full funding, both our districts were really ready to leverage that. And of course, there's this long continuum from elementary age students all the way to high school age students, including those taking advanced placement courses, where we really worked to do the best we could to meet the needs of students everywhere. And of course, there's issues around special education students. Again, what kind of technology access? Our districts are both really fortunate to have communities that have supported one-to-one technology initiatives. Leveraging those and getting those home has been huge for us. We did provide written learning packets that were available, and both our districts were able to meet essentially 100% of the need. We reached out individually to families and students, provided hotspots and internet connectivity help and support so that everybody had access. But we know during the pandemic that lots of families were struggling with lots of things. And so part of the continuity of learning plans was, in a lot of ways, you describe it more like treading water than swimming forward in a pool or, laps up and down the front of Lake Michigan. Because we know there were students that for a variety of reasons may not have been able to be connected, or family circumstances have support from parents at home or whatever. So it did hamper us a little bit in terms of how much we could move learning forward. Our teachers really worked hard to continue to engage and support students in their learning, but also you'll see on the next slide, talk about the social emotional wellness and impact of students and families. Dennis, anything to add on that?
No, I would just add that I'm, couldn't be more proud of my staff in terms of the efforts that they put in to meet the needs of their learners in an academic sense. We'll talk about the social emotional next, but I have had to remind parents and friends who have kids in the school system that we are not an online learning institution. We're bricks and mortar, face to face. That's how we've been designed, and our learners have opted for that form of education. They've chosen to enroll in a public school that is face-to-face and day-to-day. So when you have those variables, such as they may be, it's not a matter of just flipping a switch and saying, we're going to go remote, we're going to go online. It takes a tremendous amount of effort to do that. And and I know Grand Haven is saying we've done pretty well with it, I believe. However, leveraging what we've learned moving forward is going to be the challenge, because if we do find ourselves in the future in this format again, we'd like to be even better at it than we have been these last 2 months. But that's another challenge to talk about as we get a little bit further along.
I agree, Dennis. The flexibility and agility of our collective teaching staffs, and really all of our support staffs, you'll see as we go through the rest of the slides, has been really impressive and just assuring and heartwarming in terms of people stepping up and figuring things out.
So social emotional wellness, we felt like we really needed to include this because what we're finding in Grand Haven and Spring Lake, and really school districts throughout the state of Michigan, is that there are more kids in crisis and experiencing trauma in this isolated state that the pandemic has placed them. So we're seeing more of a need for counseling and social worker support. Our school psychologists, as they are in Grand Haven, and social workers and counselors are engaged with kids on a weekly basis and a daily basis with small groups and check-ins, trying to make sure that some of our kids who are disconnected when they're at school, or who are struggling with social issues when they're in school, are getting the support they need when they're working in isolation from home. We won't know the long-term impact of some of this isolation and what the kids have experienced for a while yet, but we do know that we've seen an uptick in terms of certain concerning factors related to kids. And without wanting to go down a negative and dark path, what we're seeing is just a lot more kids who require support and counseling for what they're experiencing. And we've got up there some of our community resources. The Momentum Center and Mosaic Counseling continue to be key resources for our districts to pull from. I'll speak to Mosaic a little bit because we work very closely with Sarah Lulakowski and her team there. And they continue to engage. We're actually having QPR training this week, and QPR is question, probe, and respond, I believe, for people who are considering committing suicide. But we really believe we need to be more thoughtful and more proactive today than we've been. So we're providing QPR training in a webinar format to our students and families starting this week. Lots going on with this. This is a topic, again, that you could expand upon with an entire webinar. And I think we've seen, all of us, whether we're in business and industry or community, just a family unit at home, we're seeing more of a need in this area.
I just add, I think it's been really impressive. We've heard across the state of Michigan as we get information from the Michigan Department of Education, statewide sources, the amplification of the importance of social emotional wellness of our students and within our schools has really come to the forefront. And it's my hope that we continue. Undoubtedly, it'll continue as we look at return to school efforts in the fall, but I hope we're able to keep this as a larger priority for our students continually going forward, because we all know that students that don't feel safe at school, don't feel safe about what's happening in their life, certainly aren't at their greatest readiness to learn. So this will continue to be a really important topic. I'd say just in terms of our school staff and support, the rotation of meetings, there have been, you know, our staffs, our teaching staffs have been meeting weekly, and while they see each other in the building day to day, and maybe in traditional times didn't collectively get together, and the opportunities for our staffs to really continue to focus and talk about students, the number of shared Google Docs and spreadsheets that folks are using to communicate and make sure that nobody's falling through the cracks, again, has just been really a yeoman's effort on the part of all of our staff to make sure that we're reaching out and finding all the kids and all the families that need help and support. Dennis alluded to earlier, just what we think is a really great story, being able to provide access to food. This again is, I do credit state officials and even federal officials for waivers to make it easy for us to provide food and weekly meals to students. And so you see the numbers there on your screen. In the early weeks of the pandemic, over 2,000 students served in our community just between Spring Lake and Grand Haven schools. We're both seeing that start to tail off as more folks are back to work and maybe some of the income streams are better. But over 200,000 meals have been provided to students and families. Again, staff stepping up to help find new ways to pack and store and organize those meals, and our directors finding supply chains that make sure the food is fresh. And then we're making plans for summer distribution. Spring Lake's going to go through June. Grand Haven will be ready to announce our plans. We'll certainly be providing food through the summer as well. But a great opportunity. We're happy that we had the chance to support our community, but another important aspect that we just know is reality in our community, that again, meeting these basic needs to help families have some security and assurance, ultimately with our district goals of students that are ready and able to access learning is continues to be critically important.
Yeah, all I can add to that, Andy, is that we're just very proud of the efforts of our food service staff who really spearheaded it in both districts, and give them all the credit in the world for that. So, you know, as we look ahead, I think that the million-dollar question I'm getting from parents has been, what's the fall going to look like? And students, we had a webinar yesterday for our incoming 7th grade students, and that was the number one question that they have. And there's lots of conjecture out there about what the fall will look like. I think we're starting to get our heads around the reality that things are changing quickly, and that the concrete plans that we would like to have, we just won't have those for a period of time. I've seen models that project that the number of cases in Ottawa County won't peak until sometime in mid to late July. That suggests that us moving through phase 3 where we are right now and into phase 4 might not happen as quickly as we would like, and it might not happen that we get to phase 5 by the fall. However, we are planning for a variety of different scenarios that we'd like to share. All of these plans, though, at this point in time are just discussions about possibilities. They aren't, you know, definite. We don't want anybody to feel like we've gone on record to say that this is where we will be in the fall. So Andy's got some of those to share.
So again, scenarios for 2021. I'd just say there's not only are our two districts working on plans, there's a regional task force that's working at Ottawa Area Intermediate School District. That's a consortium of school leaders from across Ottawa County. The state of Michigan has 2 task force going. The governor has one. The Michigan Department of Education state superintendent is running one. And if you, after this webinar, if you just start Googling return to school for next year, you can find many really high quality resources. Lots of great organizations are providing ideas, guidance, and thought processing. But it really boils down to three essential return to school scenarios. Of course, the full return. If we got to that in Governor Whitmer's 6-phase plan, we'd have to be in phase 6 for that. But really that full return, still figuring out ways to do daily health checks on staff and students, temp checks somehow at the bus door or at the school door, and of course cleaning protocols that are more active and aggressive throughout the school day, and still likely some social distancing, trying to figure out how that works at a variety of levels. There's challenges, of course, at the high school level and middle school levels with student passing time, but even cafeterias across school district. How do you really accomplish that? A blended return, again, if there's more strict social distancing or reduced limits on how many students might be able to be in classrooms. Certainly Spring Lake and Grand Haven don't have excess square footage, so spreading out further is more challenging. And of course, you need more staff and people to do that. And you're going to hear just a little bit from Chris, the great budget challenges that we'll be facing regardless of just our typical budget challenges that would make that difficult. But that blended return might be a scenario where there's alternating days or alternating weeks of attendance for schools. It could be half days. And again, figuring out how we work that with transportation and make sure everybody has access to get to school. But that might be a starting scenario. Again, before vaccines and whatnot are available, that seems like there is some likelihood to that kind of scenario. And then, of course, the continued remote learning, again, much like we are in today, but as Dennis and I both said earlier, our effort is really to ramp that forward and make that more active, proactive learning, really advocate for the loss of the no harm and really engage people and students in more day-to-day lessons coming from staff and teachers to really move the learning forward, because I know everybody's concerned, we all are, about the loss of progress and what the long-term potential impact might be on that. And I'd just say, in terms of where we are and what phase for the governor, everything we do today in May and stepping into June as communities will have an impact on that. What our infection rate in Ottawa County is, what the hospitalization rate is, what the death rates are, where that second spike does or doesn't happen. What we do now will impact our opportunities in less than 100 days when we really are ready for return to school. So I know I'm mindful of that. We're encouraging all of our staff and all of our parents to be mindful of that as well. Anything I left out there, Dennis?
No, I think you covered all the bases for us there, Andy. It's the great unknown at this point. So as we look at budget impact, and Chris is going to get into some additional numbers, but you know, as you look back, now this is my 14th year as a superintendent. When I started in the superintendency 14 years ago, pre that 2007 to 10 recession, typically 80% of a district's costs were tied into personnel. Then 2007 to 10, when we had to shed a lot of non-people costs in order to make our budgets work, we saw a shift where districts are 85 and sometimes even 90% into personnel. So the vast majority of my budget is tied up in people, and that's as it should be. Frankly, we are a people business. So when we look at that item number one there, the continuity of learning plans that were required of districts also required us to not cut staff, to continue to pay our employees through the end of the year. So no ability during the school year to shed costs. And that's been wonderful for my employees who are hourly and who haven't had as much to do around the district in terms of work. We've had some of them coming in to help us with different tasks, but nothing like what they typically would have been doing before. So we couldn't shed costs, and we're in a position now where item number two, we're looking at potentially a proration before the end of the year, and all kinds of numbers have been thrown around. I typically, because I have 2,500 students, when I think about a proration of $100, I know that's a $250,000 reduction. I've heard up to a $300 proration this year discussed. That'd be $750,000 out of a $28.5 million budget in Spring Lake. So those are significant figures. It's a tough nut for us because this was one of those years I think most districts were really looking forward to, ending the year with a balanced budget and going into next year pre-pandemic with a very positive and optimistic outlook on what next year would hold budgetarily. So the proration is a possibility before the end of the year. We might not know about that any earlier than July. And then as we look to projections for next year, we're anticipating, due to some shortfalls that Chris is going to discuss, that we may be cutting, let's just say $700 per pupil. Again, $700 per pupil in Spring Lake, that's $1.75 million out of a $28.5 million budget that has about 85 to 88% of its cost tied to the people. So figuring out how we're going to address those challenges is going to be something that's very unique over the next 6 months, really to 18 months, I believe, as we work through what's going to happen with the economy and how schools are going to be able to keep their heads above water. All of this in a time when we're going to see a greater demand than ever on having the right number of people on staff and in place to deal with educational issues as well as social and emotional issues.
I'll just give the Grand Haven reference on those numbers for anybody that might be willing. We're about 6,000 students and about a $73 million budget. So a $300 proration this year equates to about 1.8 million for us, and a $700 cut next year is in the neighborhood of 4.2 million in terms of cuts and reductions. You know, in the school business, we work on fund balance as our rainy day fund in our reserve. That 4.2 million would take half of our fund balance, leaving us with just under 6%. And so not much room to wiggle there in terms of future issues. You know, we know 2021, 22 is also going to be a challenging budget year as we continue to move out of this. So with that, I think this is our last slide. Chris Glass has joined the call and been listening. Again, he's the Director of Legislative Affairs for the West Michigan Talent Triangle, represents the 41 public school districts in Ottawa, Kent, and Muskegon counties. He's an expert on all things at the state level, school aid fund, and lots of legislative things. But I'm going to stop the screen share, invite Chris to just introduce himself quickly, and he's got his own set of slides here to share.
Thank you, Andy, for that introduction, and very much appreciate the opportunity to share what are some significant concerns on the school side as we try to manage through this pandemic and try to plan for what the future holds. And as you might imagine, when it comes to school finance or even regulations that schools have to abide by, it's very complex. And yet, I think one of the challenges that school leaders have faced, Dennis alluded to the fact that there was a requirement we continue to pay all staff. There's a gap in understanding in the general community's mind about the financial situation our state is in and how that's going to impact school budgets. And ultimately, I think everybody's pushing towards wanting to have a safe environment for their kids to return to in the fall. And in order to do that, some things are going to have to be put in place. So what I've done is I put together a few slides just to provide some context, and I will put those on the screen now.
While Chris adjusts gets his slide going, I'm just going to mention that we'll use the chat feature at the end of Chris's presentation to ask questions. Joy will manage that. So if you got questions that arose and you don't want to forget them while Chris is presenting that came up for Dennis or I, please just feel free to enter those in the chat, and Joy will come back to those at the end. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Andy. And so really it was now 3 weeks ago, the senator who oversees the K-12 budget made this comment to a Capital News subscription and said, cutting the foundation grant is the last resort, but it's going to happen. At this read, he told MERS the 10% level will not get the job done, and more likely the target is between 20 and 25%. I think that was a pretty shocking statement that really got the attention of many folks trying to figure out just how bad the financial circumstance we're in and what that means for us going forward. Now, I do think those numbers are probably a little inflated based on the best information we have now, but under any circumstance are very stark when you take them under consideration. There's a few challenging circumstances that face schools right now in this particular environment. One is there's a misalignment between the state and the school district fiscal years. School districts operate on a July 1 to June 30 fiscal year. Our state operates on an October 1 to September 30 fiscal year. And what I think is important to understand for folks is that the revenues, as school districts finish out their school year right now, the revenues that they're expecting to get are predicated on tax collections that are happening in this fiscal year up until October 1st. And so as we miss projections as a state of what we expected to collect, it's going to further strain government services and budgets that are relying on tax revenue. Dennis Furton alluded to this. Executive Order 2020-65 did require the payment of all district employees to continue to receive state funding. You know, this is a question I get a lot of, and one of the challenging circumstances is we've seen an expansion of unemployment benefits that individuals have been able to take advantage of. We've seen programs from the federal government like the Paycheck Protection Program. All of those things are avenues that we have not been able to utilize as school districts in order to try to save costs during this time. And the reality is, in some ways, if you did shift individuals into some of those other lanes, those are costs that have to be made up through other government resources as well. So just want to put that perspective. And since we're so late in the school year, if there was any funding reduction for this current year, it would result in districts pulling from fund balances. Please know that fund balances are not just end of year cash on hand. It's very fluid in the amount of resources districts have as they have to pay personnel and we're receiving state aid payments throughout the year. At any given time, they may even have to borrow from cash flow purposes to make sure they're able to meet their obligations as a district. And so it's a little bit different than what you may perceive to be a checking account that districts have cash on hand. So what does it look like for fiscal year 2019 and 20? Just as early as January, we were expecting the general fund to collect roughly $11.01 billion and our school aid fund to collect $13.925 billion. By May, those revisions were down to where they're expecting an 18.8% departure from those January estimates for the general fund and a 6.5% departure for the school aid fund. All total $3.2 billion on what is roughly a $26 billion state budget in terms of state revenues that are collected across the board. And so significant financial challenges for this fiscal year that we're currently in. And all of these revenues are predicated on best estimates of what's going to happen with our economy going forward. And many times those are optimistic projections that we're going to get up and running. And so these numbers could certainly change throughout the summer. What's important to note is this is a structural budget deficit at this point in time. They are projecting these shortfalls to be not only for this current year that we're about to finish up, but also it's going to impact next year. And they're expecting that shortfall to carry forward, which would be a $3 billion amount. And so we do have a structural issue that we need to address as a state, and we need to take a multifaceted approach to make sure we're able to prioritize government services and services that are needed for our citizens. To put this in context, in January 2009, we also talk about the the Great Recession that Michigan went through. This is 2 times larger, this revision that we saw within the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference, 2 times larger than what it was during 2009. So that gives you some idea of the magnitude of just how much our economy is struggling during this pandemic and what we're trying to do, obviously, to control the public health side of this. But those are significant numbers. What's the bottom line? If you took the shortfall that exists right now and you applied it from the school aid fund to all the pupils in the state, it's roughly $750 per pupil. There is a specific process the state goes into if they're going to make reductions, certain formulas and certain funding streams that are protected. If they were to do that with the shortfall, it falls to about $650 per pupil reduction. Just to inform everybody, there has been no proration process started at this point in time. And so usually what happens anytime the state believes and the state treasurer believes there are not sufficient revenues to cover the expenditures, they have to begin a process by which they get to a balanced budget by October 1st. There's many decisions that go into that process. There's many different considerations that go into that process, but nothing has formally started, but it is something that is a potential down the road. Superintendent Furton alluded to this. I think it's important to understand the vast majority of our budgets go into people. And so when you talk about that and you look at it in terms of a safe reopening for students, it's going to take resources to make sure we have the personnel on staff to not only meet student needs from an academic sense, but also to make sure that we have people in place to make sure we have a safe learning environment for students. And so one of the struggles I think school district leaders have had to face is when you're looking at budget reductions, you see what that means to the organization. It means fewer people at a time when a reopening is likely going to take additional resources if there are significant guidelines that we have to follow, and we expect there will be. It was just 2 weeks ago, Governor Whitmer put this image out there, and this is a part of a presentation that was a task force that put forward. The University of Michigan developed this, but what it attempted to do is quantify what is the risk score of different sectors of our economy, and what do we need to be mindful of for various sectors of what guidelines they have to follow when they reopen. One of the things I think is important for people to understand for schools is that K-12 education has one of the highest risk scores, or the highest risk score of any other sector out there. And so you very well could see that as a state, we make progress on the different phases the governor has outlined. And then we get to fall, and K-12 education has one of those higher risk scores. There's some inherent risk that goes along with that that's likely going to mean increased guidelines that we have to adhere to. But also, you know, we could be the reason, if there is community spread, by which we take steps backwards as a state with the various phases. None of us want that to happen. None of us are planning for that to happen, but it is a reality I think we need to be mindful of. So what does this look like? This gives information regarding the governor's phases of what it takes to transition to each phase and sort of what restrictions are going to be lifted as we progress. And phase 5 is really where they talk about K-12 and higher education being able to provide live instruction. And that comes with significant increased guidelines regarding social distancing, face coverings, making sure you're not having large congregations and gatherings of students. So some significant disruptions to what we perceive to be normal school operations come along with following those guidelines. What also has been challenging is to follow, whether it be at the federal level, the Center of Disease Control, guidelines that they're putting out, and trying to make sure that we're planning for all the different contingencies that we may face going forward. In March, the federal government passed a historic stimulus package of over $2 trillion. I wanted to put some context of what that $2 trillion means for public schools. Of the $2 trillion, less than 1% of that was actually dedicated to public schools across the country at $16.5 billion. And so there's a couple of things to point out there. Significantly less than what we saw from the federal government in terms of financial support during the 2008 through 2011 recession. And this gives you that context. Actually, 81% less resources have been allocated thus far from the federal government for K-12 schools than what we saw during the last Great Recession. And the economists are predicting that this is an economic impact that's 2.5 times greater than what we saw during the Great Recession. So what does this mean for the resources of that less than 1%? Michigan received about $480 million for state budgets to be distributed to districts through a specific formula. And largely those resources were to help districts make sure they had adequate plans in place for those COL plans that were spoke about. But when you look at it and you break it down on a per pupil basis, for Spring Lake, that means $38 roughly per student. For Grand Haven, that means roughly $71 per student. This is not near what is going to be needed to fill a budget shortfall going forward. So with that, that concludes the formal presentation. From the perspective of the superintendents and others, and we heard yesterday from Governor Whitmer, there's a strong push to try to get additional package, stimulus package passed at the federal level because we realize that that's going to be needed in order to try to preserve what we have in terms of school and what we're able to provide students in terms of services. But appreciate the opportunity to speak and looking forward to the dialogue and the question and answer portion.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you, Dennis and Andy. We don't have any questions yet, but as always, I have some questions. Chris, probably this is more geared towards you because you spend the majority of your time in Lansing. But you know, currently there's a House Bill 5761 that has to do with a potential deferment of taxes. Can you kind of weigh in on what kind of an impact that might have on our public school system?
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate that, Joy. I think what needs to be understood is we understand the business community and what this pandemic has done to businesses and impacted their financial revenue streams. and which then impacts, their ability to make payments. And sometimes the summer tax bill is one of the larger line items and expenses that businesses do have. But when we look at a policy like being proposed and would allow a deferment of tax payments for a period of time, what we need to make sure is there's a process by which school districts are going to receive those revenues that they were planning on, because there's cash flow issues that go into running these organizations. And one of the challenges is the state of Michigan pays them through 11 payments throughout the year. So they do not get a September fiscal payment, and most school districts rely heavily on that summer tax collection with the 18 mil non-homestead to be able to have the cash flow on hand to make sure they have the resources to start the school year and pay personnel. Beyond that, if the tax collection is delayed, you're also going to see implications for what bond payments districts have to make, that they're obligated to do so based on the collections that were expected. Those are specific amounts that are due during a certain period of time. And so there's implications to that process as well. So those are all factors that have to be under consideration. I do know, based on the testimony provided yesterday, there's an acknowledgement that there would be a significant impact to revenue streams of local governments and school districts. And so they're trying to work through, is there a way to sort of quantify and make sure that those entities are held harmless? That way there's just not a domino effect of what this pandemic has done.
Joy.
I'm muted. Would either of you gentlemen like to weigh in on this this question?
I would just say that, sometimes the best intentions result in some unintended consequences. And we're all in support, I think, of doing things to help shore up the finances of small businesses and business owners. There's no question about that. But when we do so at the expense of public schools, I think that's where we would draw a line on that. This could result in us having to borrow, as Chris alluded, could result in deferral of bond repayments for debt. It would impact the Act 18 millage within Ottawa County, which could limit our ability to meet the needs of students with IEPs. There's just a lot of things with this that I think weren't intended to be the consequences that would be the consequences. All the moving parts need to be worked in together. There needs to be a lot of collaboration with the right and left hand knowing what's going on to make good public policy and not just react to what obviously is a difficult situation for our business owners.
Certainly. Andy?
I don't have anything to add in terms of consequences. I think it's the opportunity here is this helps us all understand the symbiotic relationship between all of our organizations, the business community and the school community. Helps everybody understand our community. I mean, we had to work harder to inform the community about what our non-homestead operating millage is, and really understand why summer tax collection is critically important. As Chris alluded to, that one missing payment in September is a big dollar amount. And so bridging that gap, we work hard as districts to make our cash flow work just like businesses do, so that we don't incur additional costs. So I'm glad at least this raises it to the level that we can all start to understand the impacts on each other in our day-to-day operations.
I completely agree, because the unintended consequences, I think of some of the actions that are taken with all best intentions by everyone, have ramifications that none of us are really prepared for. And the symbiotic relationship between education, government, and our businesses is really critical that we pay attention to all of them. So in Washington, back to Chris again, where do we as a community need to go to try and help support some additional funding? I mean, is it writing our legislators? Is it what is it doing? Because the slide that you showed about the reduction of the amount of funding that's coming to support our educational institutions is really kind of challenging for us.
Yeah, absolutely, Joy. Thank you for the opportunity with this. Recently, we've launched what is a forward public-facing advocacy campaign done in West Michigan called Our Kids, Our Future. And so there's an opportunity if people were interested, and I'll put the website in the chat feature, but It's ourkidsfuturemi.com. That gives a very easy way through some specific tailored messaging for individuals to reach out to their member of Congress. We are being very intentional in making sure we're apolitical in what this is. We do not believe education should be politicized. And so we're not recommending a specific House proposed package or a specific Senate proposed package. We're trying to help people understand the implications of inaction out of Washington, which really is our best hope to sustain our operations. And we're trying to encourage our members of Congress to take swift action, quick action, so that we can plan appropriately for what school is going to look like when we reopen in the fall. And so that's really the drive and the push. There's been great and tremendous community support. There's been awareness that's been generated based on, how has the CARES Act impacted schools, or is it sufficient? And so all of that has been positive.
Chris, can you share that, send that information to us of how people connect to that, and we'll be sure and put it out to folks in our community. We have a question. Has any thought been given to giving some kind of summer help to the kids who have been really struggling with the remote learning, perhaps keeping the Chromebook, additional access to some of the teachers, any structural programs? Dennis, Andy, who wants to take that one?
I'll take a first shot at it, and I think Andy and I are probably close to the same page. We are going to be providing some summer programming, and it's actually greatly expanded over what we've offered in the past. The challenge right now is that we still are going to be doing it remotely. So the students who struggled with remote learning, in terms of the pace of it perhaps, or their ability really to engage, they're still going to have those struggles. We are not able at this point in time to do face-to-face learning, and until we are, our only option is to do something remotely. But we are offering it K-6 for our students, and they will be, those who are participating will be maintaining their Chromebooks or iPads during the summer months, at least until the program is concluded. We'll launch sometime in late June and finish in late July.
Great.
Somewhat similar in Grand Haven, we did consider keeping all our devices distributed, but ultimately decided to collect them. We are scheduled to turn over our iPads this year. The current group has been in our possession for 5 years, so we're making a new purchase, and our technology department needs to renew those and have them ready for the fall. And same, just the annual maintenance that we do on our devices. So we did collect. Like Dennis said, it's a struggle. Students that have struggled will unfortunately likely continue to struggle in an environment that's remote. But all of our districts, starting at Grand Haven and across Ottawa County, are actively assessing options and plans for when any summer programming face-to-face might be able to happen, watching governor's orders very closely, trying to have readiness in the background so that if there does become a window for some face-to-face or different types of opportunities, our districts can have readiness for those as well.
Fantastic. I'm wondering if, from Dennis and Andy, your perspectives, we talked a little bit about connecting with Washington, of really supporting our school systems and urging our legislators to really consider the implications of funding packages and that sort of thing, and trying to remain non-political. I mean, and in this environment, it's kind of hard to remain non-political, because it seems like everything turns into something political. But from each of your standpoints, what can we do as a community to support our educational, both institutions? We have so many amazing teachers. You both have managed exemplary school systems that shine. How do we as a community, what would your wish be for us to provide back to you to help you weather this current condition that we're all in?
That's a big question, Joy. I'll say our community already does amazing things. So we just ask for that continued support. I'd say Grand Haven schools saw it on the May 5 election. We had almost 3 times the voter turnout, and actually a better yes rate than we get annually on our non-homestead millage. We see that as a strong endorsement and support for our schools. And so taking opportunities to voice that, both to Representative Huizenga at the federal level, but even making sure that with our local legislators, even though they may not have the control, Jim Lilly, Senator Roger Victory, Representative Lilly, I should say, they may not have the specific control or options. We all know that they do work and talk in similar circles, and so making sure that we as a community say that, again, all of our relationships are interdependent. The business community, the education community, and ultimately we need this to be a short impact on our students and in what's going to be the long-term impact on our communities. So working together to find solutions and understand the trailing impacts going forward. Just continue to ask questions, continue to seek to understand. I appreciate, again, all the people that have joined this webinar because you learn a little bit more each and every time and understand how to share it with your friends, neighbors, community about what is happening, what the positives are, what the potential negatives are. We're all taking our hits throughout this in schools. Our message today is schools maybe short term in the last 2 or 3 months have not been impacted fiscally, but we know that's potentially coming. And as all the economic streams go forward, that is going to have a bigger impact on our broader community.
And not a lot I can add to what Andy said. I think advocacy is the biggest thing. We are both lucky. We represent communities that strongly support their school system. And that I've never questioned it. I don't think there's any challenge to it. This won't challenge that either. But we do need advocacy where appropriate. We need support out of Washington to backfill these budgets. That's just a reality. There's a lot at stake for our kids that we can't downplay. I can't overstate how important it is that we have the resources we need to meet the needs of our kids come fall, no matter the educational platform that we're teaching from. There will be needs. It'll be the longest gap in learning that many kids have had. I count the last 2 months of school as learning, but it wasn't normal. By the time we get kids seated in seats and in front of their teacher again, it's going to be a long gap for them. So any advocacy, and then for my community, we need patience and grace because this is hard. We're struggling. We're all struggling. And my kids, they need to know that they're loved and that they're safe. Those are things that our community provides all the time, but I can't overemphasize how important it is our kids feel loved and safe during this time.
Yeah, patience and grace seems to be the words of the day. Chris, you had something to add?
Yeah, I would add just an understanding and from an advocacy perspective and even beyond the finances. In order for us to operate these continuity of learning plans, the governor had to suspend over 100 various laws that we are bound to operate as schools. And so we're going to need to make sure we have continued flexibility going into the fall and next year so that we can meet the needs of students based on the conditions that exist in our communities. And so I think that also brings it to another challenge that we have to overcome. Traditionally, schools are funded 90% based on one day in October of kids that are present in their seat. And we know there are going to be a lot of families out there who have different feelings and thoughts about the guidelines schools have to operate in, what a reopening looks like and whether or not it's safe for their child. And they're going to make decisions regarding education for that. We need to make sure that we have decisions made on the front end so there's some certainty so that our district leaders, our fantastic leaders, can plan accordingly heading into the school year. So as much as there's some uncertainty that exists out there with how much per student we're expecting to receive or a potential reduction, there also is uncertainty about how various families are going to react to the conditions by which we're allowed to operate under. And so I think more than ever that grace that Dennis spoke to is going to be important because there's a wide variety of opinion, as you might imagine, on this topic. And that's going to work its way into the schools as well.
Yep, for sure. There's another question. Do you have any sense if K-12 reopening plans are likely to be driven on a statewide basis as the initial closure was versus allowing a more regional approach? Has there been any discussion about that in Lansing?
So right now there's several committees that are underway, not only at the Department of Education level, but also the governor has formed a task force and they've started a partnership with some public health experts that have had experience in different outbreaks and, you know, what do you need to look at? Ultimately, I think what they're trying to do there is they're trying to say here, based on what we see from the CDC, based on what we see from other countries and states who perhaps have gone through this a little earlier, what things and protocols do we need to have in place so districts can plan accordingly? I do think at the end of the day, as we transition towards live instruction, there is going to be a more regional approach and consideration to where, all right, you know, in West Michigan or in the school districts, if there's not community spread and we don't see any spread within the schools, you know, there's a different operating procedure that they're going to be able to work within compared to what we might see perhaps if Southeast Michigan has a flare up and what they're going to have to do. So it's probably going to be one of those tight, loose frameworks to where, hey, here's some overarching guidelines, but if there is some spread, here's what then the expectation is to transition and make sure the public health side is protected. But all of that's going to take a lot of work. And as you can imagine, if schools were to have to change course, that's going to have implications for the workforce and all the businesses and down the line. So it speaks to that symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, yeah. Dennis, Andy, you want to add anything to that?
Not me. Chris understands that. I think he's got his finger on the pulse of what's going on relative to those efforts a little bit more than I do. And we're focused almost exclusively on what's going on within our community and within our school district right now, keeping our ear to the ground for, you know, what's going on more regionally and throughout the state. But I think his answer really explains where we're at.
Well, you know, it's all the more important that we really focus on making sure that community spread doesn't happen. And, you know, of course, as we begin to reopen our state, it's going to be very, very interesting, especially in the summer. Everybody needs to wear their masks, practice social distancing, and wash your hands frequently. And we can't really say that enough because we're really going to set the stage for what happens in the fall with what happens this summer. So I have a great way to close from a school board member. But I want to give you guys, before I read that, an opportunity for any closing remarks that you'd like to make to our audience. It's great. We have had so many people join us to kind of better understand the challenge. Any last words?
I'm going to jump in real quick because I've got a 12 o'clock Zoom webinar for our incoming ninth graders that I need to help facilitate. So I just want to say thanks to the Chamber again. You know, Andy and I, we talk often about our partnership, our district's partnerships, but regionally in Grand Haven, throughout our community, we've got some great partners, and the Chamber, I think, drives a lot of that. So I appreciate that. Could not explain how much I appreciate it when I hear stories from other places where the Chamber doesn't work so closely with those public sector entities within their community. Our Chamber does a great job, and this was a wonderful opportunity to provide us a platform to discuss it with some interested folks. So thank you, Joy. And with that, I have to go. Yeah. Thanks, Dennis. Have a great weekend. You all as well. Thanks. Andy?
I'll echo what Dennis said. Just, Joy, thanks for the opportunity. As Dennis said, we both just really value the partnership and relationship that we have as school districts with the Chamber. We know it doesn't exist in the same way in many, many locations. And so we feel really fortunate for that. And thanks to everybody that joined the webinar today. We value your interest, your support, your advocacy, your feedback on everything we've been doing, and feedback on everything we're going to figure out going forward. You know, true community engagement helps us all be the best we can be for the students, for the families, and ultimately our entire community.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy. Chris, any last words from you?
I think it's important for your community to understand. I have the opportunity, obviously, within West Michigan to have a lot of close relationships with superintendents, but also interact on a statewide basis. And you have two of the best right in your backyard. So your communities are well served with their leadership. I know our advocacy efforts are better off because of the input and the example that they set. And it really does take a partnership. When we talk about the work that we do and then the West Michigan Talent Triangle, it's inclusive of that talent word that also extends to the business community. And in any way we can partner, we're very grateful for that and appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Chris. And, you know, from the Chamber's perspective, we're so very proud of what our school districts have done. They're a shining star for us, and I think for the entire state of Michigan. So I want to thank both you and Dennis and Chris. It's a pleasure having you on. And I think that Chris Strang sent a note that I think is really appropriate to end this on. As a school board member, I encourage community advocacy for temporary federal relief for state budgets, assisting all public essential services, police, fire, health, and school. We're all in it together. We've heard it over and over again. But if we don't have healthy schools, if we don't have healthy government, our community isn't very healthy. And that's all it's important. And that's why we all live here, and we work, play, and learn in our community. And it's because of the concerted effort and partnerships that we have. So thank you all for joining us today. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Dennis and Chris. Chris Strang, thank you for your comments. Appreciate it very much. I hope you all have an amazing weekend, and remember to talk to your legislators. Have a great day.